Whenever somebody uses the term Sega, like in a sentence, like, oh, I used to own the Sega, they're usually referring to the Genesis. After all, it was Sega's most successful console. You may already know about their predecessor, the Sega Master System, but that wasn't their first console. They actually released a more obscure console in Japan, but you don't hear about this one much. Why not? And why did this console lose to the Famicom? Well, let's take a look. You guys know how happy I am that this semester is finally over? What's going on, guys? It's Podrez, coming at you with another video. So, we're going to be talking about Sega's first ever game console, but first I actually have an announcement. I finally made a Discord server. I think this will be a really cool way to get to know each other. I'm excited to learn about our community. So right now we got a small little community in there. We got about 10 members in there. So if you're interested, just go to discord.podrez.net. It will redirect right to the invite link. I'll also post a link directly in the description. And then if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right there. It only takes a quick second, but it helps our community grow. All right, let's get started. In the early 80s, Sega established themselves as one of the best arcade manufacturers. However, the arcade scene was starting to slow down in 1982. The market was oversaturated with too many arcade machines, but not enough people willing to put quarters into any of them. This decline was really hurting Sega because a lot of their revenue was coming from their arcade titles. In order for them to stay alive, Sega needed to adapt, so they turned their attention to the home console market. The original idea was to release a computer called the SC3000, but they noticed that Nintendo was planning on making a console that played cartridges. It wasn't a computer that was able to perform multiple tasks, it was just a unit that was designed to play games, and that's it. So as a response, they began development on the SG-1000, which would become Sega's first ever video game console. This would mean that Sega and Nintendo would become competitors in the home console market. In fact, Sega decided to release the SG-1000 on the same day as the Nintendo Famicom, July 15th, 1983. They would also release the SC3000 like originally planned. On paper, Sega's new console had some things going for it. For one, it had a bigger library of games than the Famicom by the end of 1983. The SG-1000 had 21 games available for purchase, while the Famicom only had 9. Secondly, the SG-1000 sold more units than Sega originally expected. The Famicom had a slow start because earlier versions contained bad chipsets which caused them to crash, so they had to be recalled. So while the Famicom was still getting its acts together, the SG-1000 was starting out strong. In its first year, Sega sold 160,000 units when they only expected 50,000. They even sold the SG-1000 at a higher price point, 15,000 yen, than the Famicom, which was only 14,800 yen. So while Sega initially had success with the SG-1000, it didn't take long for Nintendo to catch up. Now, even though these consoles came out on the same day, when you play them side by side, it's obvious which one was better. So while Sega had a head start with the amount of games that were available in the first year, Nintendo's lineup of games was better. Sega prioritized porting some of their classic arcade titles to the SG-1000, but none of their games had the same brand recognition that Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye had, which were the Famicom launch titles. Nintendo was also very flexible with third-party developers. The Famicom had a lot of third-party support, which really worked in the console's favor. Sega, on the other hand, was very reluctant to work with third-party developers because a lot of them were Sega's competitors. If you look at the lineup of SG-1000 games, most of them were developed by Sega. It only gets worse when you play the games because it's clear that the hardware capabilities are much worse than on the Famicom. The console couldn't support as many colors, the scrolling was very choppy, a lot of the sprites were only one color, and the games didn't have much content. Remember, this console came out on the same day as the Famicom, and it was more expensive. Shouldn't the hardware be similar, if not better? But before we judge the console, let's look at some of the games. Alright, here's Starjacker. It's a very basic shooter, not much to say about it. You play as 4 spaceships, and each time you get hit, you lose one of them. If you lose them all, it's game over. Having all 4 spaceships intact means you have more firepower, but it also means you're a bigger target, so it's kind of a trade-off. What's nice is you regain all your spaceships in between stages. I do want to comment on the music because it does create a great atmosphere and it sounds great. I do give the SG-1000 credit in the sound and music department. Overall, this is a decent arcade port, but it's repetitive and super basic. Alright, let's look at Congo Bongo. I'm actually kinda disappointed because they went with a 2D style platformer here rather than the isometric 3D style that the arcade version had. Even the ColecoVision one was able to handle the isometric style, and that was an older console. Why couldn't the SG-1000 version do this? So I mean, this one is playable, but disappointing considering what it could have been. Now let's try Zippy Race. You're on a motorcycle and you must make it as far as possible while avoiding obstacles and cars. There's no lives in this game, instead you have to make sure you don't run out of gas. If you do, it's an automatic game over. It's actually a very fun title, but unfortunately for Sega, the Famicom also got this game and it's much better. The scrolling is smoother, the graphics are better, and it's faster paced. Now let's try Wonder Boy. It's a side-scroller. When you first start the game, you're completely defenseless, but you can collect a hammer, which gives you a projectile that you can throw at enemies. This is a very fun game when you play it on other consoles, but this version has some control issues. The choppy scrolling makes it difficult to aim your jumps, and for some reason the Cobra enemies magically appear in the middle of the screen, giving you very little reaction time. This game was released on the Famicom under the name Adventure Island, and this one is much better, so once again, Sega loses this round. Let's try Flicky. It's weird to think that Flickies predate the Sonic series. Anyway, you play as a bird that's supposed to guide the smaller birds to the exit before the cats get them, or you. The arcade version of this game is a lot of fun, but the one we got on the SG-1000 has some control issues. Like with Wonder Boy, it's very difficult to aim your jumps properly. In the arcade game, I had no issues migrating from the lower platforms to the higher ones, but here I kept missing my target. It's frustrating because I kept trying to reach the top platforms, but I just couldn't seem to do it. Now this isn't a bad version of the game, but the controls could have used some work. Last game we'll look at is Doki Doki Penguin Land. Here, you have to safely move an egg down a large vertical stage. As you might imagine, the egg is very frail, so you can't drop it from too high of a height, and enemies will break the egg if they make contact with it. You can make platforms in front of you disappear, which will help you descend the egg where you want it to go. It kinda reminds me of Lode Runner. Unlike the other games, the jumping is actually very good in this one. The scrolling is definitely choppy, but it doesn't affect the gameplay like it does in the others. The only control issue I had was making the blocks disappear. A few times I was facing the wrong way and I accidentally removed the wrong block, and there's no way to undo it. But outside of that, this is actually a very fun title. This is by far the best game I've played on the SG-1000, and it's proof that a game can still be good even if the console has limitations. So to summarize, none of these games are bad, but it's extremely obvious that the Famicom was way more powerful. When you compare any game side by side, the Famicom wins every time. Why would Sega release a console that's obsolete? Well, to be fair, it wasn't as obvious in 1983 because mappers were not common yet, and a lot of the earlier Famicom titles were just a single screen. But when more games started being released in the coming years, it was obvious which console was better, if it wasn't obvious already. Even when you compare the SG-1000 to other consoles that were released around that time, it still doesn't hold up well. The games look very similar to what you would see on the ColecoVision or Atari 5200, and those are older consoles. The SG-1000 was definitely not ahead of its time. If anything, it was far behind. Unfortunately for Sega, the Famicom continued to be successful in the later years while the SG-1000 died. But there is some good news. Sega would revise the SG-1000 a couple times. The first version, which was called the SG-1002 or the Mark II, it had detachable controllers, which was nice, but the hardware was exactly the same, and it wasn't anything special, to be honest. The second revision, however, did have some improvements in the hardware department, and this would eventually become the Sega Master System or the Mark III in Japan. Because the hardware was based off the SG-1000, the Japanese Mark III would be backwards compatible with SG-1000 games. Sega was one of the best arcade developers in the early 80s, but because of a recession in the arcade market, they had to come up with a new way to generate revenue. As a response to Nintendo's upcoming Famicom, Sega made their own game console and released it on the same day. But when playing the games, it was obvious which console was the better of the two. The SG-1000 had very choppy scrolling, not very many colors on screen, and very little detail in the sprites. If you compare both consoles side by side, the Famicom wins every time. So while Sega did have some early success with the SG-1000, Nintendo did catch up and blew it right out of the water. But even though this console was mediocre, it does have some importance because it did establish Sega as a console developer rather than just a game developer, and a few years later, they would become one of Nintendo's biggest threats. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.